All right, buckle up everyone, we're diving deep into economics today. Got your study guide and textbook right here, ready to uncover those essential nuggets from each chapter.
It's like we're on a treasure hunt, sifting through the pages to find those golden insights.
Absolutely. Think of this as your express lane to understanding the core of economics. We'll hit the high points, the stuff you really need to know.
And maybe uncover some hidden gems along the way, those little details that make the learning stick.
Exactly. And I've got the perfect guide for this journey, an expert in making even the most complex economic ideas crystal clear.
Well, I do try my best to connect the dots and make the stuff relatable.
So let's jump right in. Chapter 1, Production, Income, and Spending. It's like the foundation of everything, right?
Yeah, you could say that. It's all about understanding the nuts and bolts of how economies actually work. And your document starts by emphasizing the learning outcomes for this chapter. Really wants to make sure you get a grip on those factors of production, how they all work together to create the goods and services we rely on.
Right, the factors of production.
Yeah.
Those are like the essential ingredients.
Yeah.
We're talking natural resources, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship.
Exactly. And the document really emphasizes the importance of grasping how these factors combine, how they interact to actually determine an economy's capacity to produce.
So it's not just about having a lot of resources, it's about how you use them.
Exactly. Efficiency is key, right? And speaking of efficiency, your textbook highlights this idea of human capital.
Ah, human capital. So it's not just about how many workers you have, it's about their skills and education.
Exactly. It's about the quality of the workforce, their health, their knowledge. All of that contributes to an economy's productivity.
Makes sense. And of course, we can't forget entrepreneurship. The study guide mentions that we should be able to explain the role of entrepreneurship in production.
Oh, absolutely. Those are the risk takers, the innovators, the ones who bring together all those other factors of production to create something new and valuable.
So they're like the driving force, the ones who see opportunities and make things happen.
Precisely. And your document goes on to emphasize that you should be able to differentiate between the different decision-making units in an economy.
Okay, so we're talking about households, firms, the government, and the foreign sector. The study guide mentions those.
Yeah, exactly. Each one plays a distinct role in the economy, and your document dives into how they all interact within that circular flow of income and spending.
Ah, the circular flow. It's like a constant dance of money moving between different parts of the economy.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the document stresses that you need to be able to, distinguish between these units and really understand their functions within that flow.
So it's like a giant ecosystem with different players all interconnected and influencing each other.
Absolutely. And the circular flow model is a great way to visualize those interactions. It shows how households provide labor and other factors to firms, receive income in return, and then spend that income on, well, the goods and services produced by those firms.
Right. It's this continuous cycle of earning and spending.
Exactly. And your document actually wants you to go beyond just understanding the individual transactions. It wants you to really grasp the interconnectedness of the entire system.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the document also mentions something about injections and leakages into this circular flow. What are those all about?
Ah, yes. Injections, those represent additions to the flow. Things like government spending, investments, exports, they all boost economic activity.
So they're like adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. And then you have leakages, which are withdrawals from the flow. Things like savings, taxes, imports, they can actually dampen economic activity.
So it's like a balancing act between these forces that push the economy forward and those that hold it back.
Absolutely. It's a constant interplay between those injections and leakages, shaping the overall level of economic activity. The study guide even specifically says that we need to be able to illustrate the circular flow diagrammatically.
Oh, right. Like actually draw it out and use real-world examples from the South African economy. The study guide does mention that.
Exactly. It's not just about memorizing a diagram from a textbook. It's about applying that model to a real context. Think about how government spending on infrastructure, like new roads or bridges, could boost the South African economy.
Right. That would be an injection of spending, creating jobs, and stimulating demand.
Precisely. And if those infrastructure projects use a lot of imported materials, that could represent a leakage as some of that spending flows out of the domestic economy.
Ah, I see. So it's about understanding those complex connections and the potential trade-offs involved.
Exactly. Now, speaking of things that aren't factors of production, your document specifically mentions that money itself doesn't fall into that category.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Money is just a medium of exchange, a tool that makes those transactions within the circular flow possible.
Precisely. The document seems to be pushing you to think beyond just the surface level. Money is important, of course, but it's ultimately a representation of the value that's generated through production.
So money is like the fuel that powers the economic engine, but it's not the engine itself.
Exactly. And speaking of engines, your document actually highlights another important point. It emphasizes that infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, power grids, those are considered capital goods.
That's right. It's not just about machinery and factories. Those investments in infrastructure are crucial for supporting long-term economic growth.
Yeah.
And the document even mentions we need to be able to differentiate between the different types of capital.
Oh, absolutely. It dives into the differences between social capital, human capital, and physical capital, highlighting the importance of each one.
So it's about recognizing that those investments in infrastructure, education, and social networks are all essential for a thriving economy.
Exactly. It's about laying that foundation for efficient production, transportation, communication, all those things that make an economy hum.
Okay, that makes sense. Now on to Chapter 2, the monetary sector. Time to dive into the world of money and banking.
All right. Sounds good to me. And your study guide's got a nice, clear roadmap for you on this one. It starts by outlining those learning outcomes again, stressing that you really need to grasp what money actually is, how it's created, and how it impacts the economy as a whole.
So first things first, what exactly makes something money? The textbook actually spends a lot of time on this.
Okay.
It talks about bartering, the gold standard, even cryptocurrency.
Yeah, it's a fundamental question, isn't it? And your document really emphasizes those key characteristics that make something suitable to be used as money. It has to be widely accepted as a medium of exchange.
Right, so people need to be willing to use it to buy and sell things.
Exactly. It also needs to be a store of value, meaning it holds its worth over time. And of course, it needs to be a unit of account, providing a common measure for comparing the value of different things.
Okay, so it's like a triple threat. It has to function as a way to buy stuff, hold its value, and give us a way to compare the value of different goods and services. The study guide seems to want us to really internalize this, go beyond just memorizing a definition.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the role money plays in all those transactions, how it enables savings and investments, and ultimately how it drives the entire economic engine. And here's an interesting point your textbook raises. It actually says that money itself doesn't earn a return, and it might even lose value because of inflation.
Wait, so if money doesn't grow, like, say, investments, why do people hold on to so much of it? Especially, those really wealthy individuals.
That's a great question, and the document wants you to grapple with it. While money might not offer the potential for big returns like stocks or real estate, it does offer liquidity and security. It's readily available for transactions. It's like a safety net during times of uncertainty. Wealthy individuals, they diversify, right? So they might use money for immediate needs, but also invest in assets for long-term growth.
That makes sense. It's about finding that balance between easy access to funds and the potential for those long-term gains.
Exactly.
Okay, let's tackle those different measures of money supply now. M1, M2, and M3. These always seem to trip people up.
Ah, yes, the M's. But they're not as intimidating as they might seem at first glance. The study guide says we should be able to differentiate between these various definitions and their components.
So they're like different ways of measuring how much money is actually circulating in the economy.
Exactly. Think of them as like increasingly broader definitions of money, each capturing a different level of liquidity. So you have M1, the narrowest measure, includes things like currency in circulation and those checkable deposits.
Okay, so that's basically the money we can readily use for everyday transactions.
Precisely. And then you have M2, which adds things like savings deposits, money market funds, and small time deposits. These are assets that are a bit less liquid but can be converted to cash fairly easily. Your study guide specifically mentions paying attention to how South Africa defines M3.
Right, like it might be different from other countries.
Exactly. Good catch. And then you have M3, the broadest measure. It includes even less liquid assets like large time deposits and repurchase agreements.
So it's getting more inclusive as we go up the ladder. But the document wants us to understand that these different measures give us a more nuanced view of the money supply.
Absolutely. And this is where the role of those financial intermediaries comes in. banks, for instance. They play a key role in actually creating money through that process of fractional reserve banking.
Ah, fractional reserve banking. That's a concept I've always found fascinating. Can you break that down for us?
Of course. So banks, they don't just keep all the money deposited with them in a vault, right? They only hold a fraction as reserves, lending out the rest. And those loans, well, they actually create new deposits, effectively increasing the money supply. The document stresses that we should be able to explain this whole process, especially using that idea of the money multiplier.
So it's like a chain reaction of money creation.
Exactly. The money multiplier, it measures that potential increase in the money supply for every rand, or dollar or euro that's injected into the banking system. And the study guide really wants you to grasp this concept. It's all about understanding the powerful role banks play in shaping the money supply.
Okay, that's starting to make more sense. Now, what about the demand for money? I remember the textbook has all these graphs and formulas about it.
Ah, yes, the demand for money. Your study guide actually differentiates between two main motives for holding money: the transactions motive and the asset motive.
So the transactions motive, that's pretty straightforward, right? We need money to buy things to cover those day-to-day expenses.
Precisely. And the study guide mentions that this motive is closely tied to income, how much people are earning, and the frequency of those transactions happening in the economy.
Right. The more we earn and the more we spend, the more money we need on hand.
Exactly. Now, the asset motive, that one's a bit more nuanced. It's about holding money as a store of wealth, a way to preserve your purchasing power, and maybe even protect yourself from some of those uncertainties that come with the economy. And your document really wants you to understand how things like interest rates and inflation can affect this demand for money as an asset.
Okay, so if interest rates are high, people might be less likely to hold on to a lot of cash because they could earn a better return by investing it. But if things are uncertain, they might prefer to hold on to that money, even if it means missing out on potential investment gains.
Precisely. It's this interplay between risk, return, and what people expect to happen in the future. And your document actually mentions that you should be able to explain the relationship between the amount of money people demand and the interest rate, but graphically.
Right. And there's this kind of counterintuitive relationship. When interest rates are low, people tend to hold on to more money. Why is that? Shouldn't it be the other way around?
It's one of those things in economics that can trip people up. Think about it this way. When those interest rates are low, the opportunity cost of holding on to money is lower. You're not missing out on a lot of potential interest by keeping your cash instead of investing it.
Ah, I see. So it's like waiting for a better sale before making a big purchase. If interest rates are low, I might hold on to my cash, waiting for them to rise before I invest it.
Exactly. You got it.
Okay, so let's move on to Chapter 3, the role of government. This one feels especially relevant these days, doesn't it?
Definitely does. Governments, they play so many roles in our modern economies. And your study guide really stresses that you should be able to, break down those roles and understand how they can impact things. It even starts by asking why governments would intervene in markets at all, especially when those markets seem to be working just fine.
Yeah, that's a good question. Why would governments try to meddle in something that's seemingly working?
Well, the textbook points to this idea of market failure. Sometimes, markets just don't allocate those resources efficiently or fairly.
So it's not a perfect system.
Exactly. And that can lead to a bunch of problems, things like monopolies, externalities, information asymmetries. They're all mentioned in the document.
Okay, can you give me some real-world examples of those market failures?
Sure, think about monopolies. That happens when you have a single firm that dominates a market. They can set prices higher than they would be in a competitive market.
So less competition means higher prices for consumers.
Exactly. And that can stifle innovation, too. Nobody's pushing them to get better if they're the only game in town. And then you have those externalities, like pollution, a classic example from the textbook. It's when the cost of producing or consuming something spills over onto people who aren't even involved in the transaction.
Right, so it's like those hidden costs that aren't reflected in the market price.
Exactly. And then there's those information asymmetries where one party knows way more than the other.
Okay, so like when you're buying a used car and the seller might know about all sorts of problems you don't.
Exactly, that kind of situation. And your document seems to want you to go beyond just knowing the definitions of these market failures.
Right, it's about being able to spot them in real life.
Precisely. Think about the healthcare market. It's full of information asymmetries. Patients usually know a lot less about their conditions and treatments than their doctors do.
Okay, that's a good example. So in that case, governments might step in with regulations or subsidies to try and even things out a bit.
Exactly. They also try to promote equity, make things a bit fairer in terms of how resources and opportunities are distributed, things like progressive taxation or social welfare programs or tools they might use.
But of course, government intervention isn't always a magic bullet, right? The study guide has this whole section on government failure.
Right. It talks about all sorts of potential pitfalls, things like bureaucratic inefficiency, corruption, rent-seeking, where people try to manipulate the system for their own gain.
So there are risks that come with government intervention.
Oh, absolutely. The document really emphasizes that you need to weigh the potential benefits of addressing those market failures with the risks of government failure. It's not always an easy call.
Right. It's a balancing act. Now, the textbook also mentions we should be able to differentiate between the types of interventions governments can use.
That's right. There's a whole toolbox of policy options they can use. Regulations to protect consumers or the environment, taxes on harmful activities, subsidies for things they want to encourage, or even directly providing goods and services themselves, like education or national defense.
So it's like a spectrum of tools, from nudging things in the right direction to taking direct control.
Exactly. And the choice of which tools to use really depends on the context, the nature of the market failure, and the government's overall goals. Your document wants you to think critically about these choices and the trade-offs involved.
Okay, so it's not about having a one-size-fits-all approach, but understanding the nuances of each situation.
Absolutely. Now, your study guide also highlights this interesting detail about South Africa's economic history. It talks about the fact that government spending has consistently grown since 1960.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. What's the explanation for that?
Well, the textbook connects that trend to a bunch of factors, the legacy of apartheid, the transition to democracy, how the role of the state in the economy has evolved over time. It's a reminder that economics isn't just about those abstract models.
Right, it's tied to real-world events and historical forces.
Exactly. Now, ready to venture into the world of international trade? Chapter 4 awaits.
Lead the way. I'm curious to understand why countries trade with each other, even when they could, theoretically make everything themselves.
That's a great question, and your document dives right into it, outlining those key learning outcomes for this chapter. It stresses the importance of understanding these concepts of absolute and comparative advantage. They're really the foundation for grasping the benefits of international trade.
Okay, remind me about those terms again. Absolute advantage is about which country can produce more of something using the same resources, right?
Exactly. So if one country can produce 100 shirts with the same resources it takes another country to make 50, the first country has the absolute advantage in shirt production. Pretty straightforward.
Okay, that makes sense. But comparative advantage, that's where things get a little trickier, right?
Yeah, comparative advantage is all about opportunity cost. It's about which country can produce something at a lower opportunity cost, meaning what they have to give up to produce it.
Okay, so even if a country is really good at making, let's say, both shirts and cell phones, if they're even better at making shirts, they should focus on that and trade for cell phones from another country.
Exactly. Even if that other country isn't as efficient overall, if they're relatively better at making cell phones, it makes sense for them to specialize in that and trade. That way both countries can benefit. And your document actually gives you a bunch of examples to help illustrate this.
So even if a country is good at everything, they can still gain from focusing on what they're best at and trading for the rest. The study guide specifically mentions that we should be able to explain these gains from trade for the countries involved.
That's right. By specializing in trading, countries can actually consume beyond their own production possibilities. They can have more of everything, leading to higher overall well-being. The document really stresses understanding how trade can expand those possibilities and create those win-win situations.
That makes sense. But then why do we hear so much about protectionist measures, those attempts to limit trade? Why would countries do that if it's supposed to be so beneficial?
Yeah, that's a big question, and the textbook explores it in depth. One common argument is to protect domestic industries and jobs, shield them from foreign competition.
So it's about protecting those domestic workers and businesses from the pressures of globalization.
Exactly. And the document lays out those potential benefits and costs of protectionism. It acknowledges that, yes, it can provide some short-term relief for certain industries, but it can also lead to higher prices for consumers and less efficiency. And then there's the risk of retaliation from those trading partners.
Right. It's like trying to build a wall around your economy. It might seem protective, but it can also isolate you and stifle growth.
Exactly. Now, here's an interesting detail your document highlights about exchange rates. It mentions that when a currency depreciates, it can make imports more expensive and even contribute to inflation.
Wait, I thought a weaker currency was supposed to make a country's exports cheaper and more competitive.
It does, but it also works the other way around.
Yeah.
It makes the things a country imports more expensive because their currency buys less of that foreign currency. So if those imports are essential goods, raw materials or things used in production, those higher costs can ripple through the whole economy and lead to higher prices for everyone.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. It's like a chain reaction.
Mhm.
And the study guide also wants us to understand those different exchange rate systems.
Absolutely. Fixed, floating, managed, float, it goes through them all, explaining how they can impact currency values, trade, and investment patterns.
Okay, it's a complex topic, but understanding exchange rates seems crucial for navigating the global economy.
It is. Now, are you ready to dive into the world of macroeconomic measurement with Chapter 5?
Let's do it. I'm ready to learn how economists actually keep track of whole economies. And the document specifically says we need to know those different methods for calculating things like national income and output.
Great. And your study guide gives you a clear framework for understanding those methods. It starts by emphasizing those key macroeconomic indicators like GDP, GNI, and national income.
Okay, so GDP, gross domestic product, that's like the big one, right?
Yeah.
It measures the overall size and health of an economy.
It is. It's the total value of all those final goods and services produced within a country's borders over a specific period, usually a year. But your document stresses that you really need to understand what GDP includes and what it leaves out.
Right, like it only counts those final goods and services, not the intermediate ones used in production.
Exactly. Otherwise, we'd be double counting things, making the economy seem bigger than it really is. And it also doesn't include those non-market activities, like things people do at home or in the informal sector.
Okay, so it's about capturing the value of those transactions that happen in formal markets.
Precisely. And another crucial distinction the document highlights is the difference between real and nominal GDP.
Ah, yes. Real versus nominal. Can you remind me what that's all about?
Sure. Nominal GDP, that's based on the current market prices. But that can be misleading if there's inflation, right? Real GDP adjusts for those price changes using a base year. It lets us compare economic activity over time without the distortion of inflation. And the study guide mentions we should be able to, make those adjustments, convert nominal GDP to real GDP.
Right, so we could see the actual changes in output, not just changes caused by rising prices.
Yeah.
And I remember the document mentions that we should be able to calculate GDP using those three different methods.
Oh, absolutely. The income approach, the production approach, and the expenditure approach, they all offer different perspectives on the same thing. The study guide emphasizes that theoretically, they should all lead to the same GDP figure.
So it's like looking at the same economic pie, but slicing it in different ways.
Exactly. But GDP isn't the only measure of an economy's well-being, right? Your study guide also mentions things like GNI, unemployment rates, and the CPI.
Right, those are all important indicators too.
They are. The document highlights a bunch of measures that offer different lenses for looking at an economy's performance and overall health. So, GNI, or gross national income, that one focuses on the income earned by a country's residents, regardless of where they earned it.
So it's like GDP, but it factors in the income earned by citizens working abroad and excludes income earned by foreigners within the country.
Precisely. And then you have those unemployment rates. They measure the percentage of the labor force that's actively looking for work but can't find it. Your study guide also talks about the different ways unemployment is defined and measured.
Right, there's like a strict definition and a broader one.
Exactly. The document emphasizes that you need to understand the nuances of these definitions and how they can impact our interpretation of the data.
So different definitions can paint different pictures of the job market.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. It tracks those changes in the prices of a basket of consumer goods and services, giving us a measure of inflation. And your document points out this interesting tidbit about South Africa. It actually uses both a strict and an expanded definition of unemployment.
Really? What's the difference?
Well, the strict one only counts people who are actively seeking work, while the expanded one includes those who have given up actively searching, but they're still available and willing to work if the right opportunity comes along. The study guide wants you to understand why South Africa uses both definitions and how that impacts the picture of the labor market.
So the expanded definition gives us a broader view of unemployment, including those who are discouraged but could potentially return to the workforce.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond those headline numbers and really understanding the subtleties of these economic indicators.
Okay, that's an important reminder.
Yeah.
Now, what about Chapter 6? This one's a bit of mystery, right? The chapter title is missing in the study guide.
It is a bit mysterious, but that doesn't mean we can't figure out what's going on in there.
Right, we've got our detective hats on, ready to decipher this economic puzzle. What clues can we gather from the study guide itself?
Well, from what I can see, this chapter seems to build on the previous one.
Yeah.
Delving deeper into those applications of macroeconomic measurement and analysis, like connecting the dots between the theory and the real world.
So if Chapter 5 was about the tools, this chapter is about actually using them.
Exactly. It's about going beyond the definitions and formulas and seeing how these concepts actually play out in practice. And your document provides some case studies and real-world examples to help you apply what you've learned.
Okay, so what specific topics or themes does this untitled chapter explore?
Well, it starts by really getting into the nitty-gritty of calculating and interpreting those key macroeconomic indicators for South Africa, like walking you through using real-world data to measure GDP, GNI, inflation, unemployment, the whole shebang.
So it's like a hands-on workshop on applied macroeconomics.
Exactly. And then it shifts gears a bit, exploring those links between, macroeconomic performance and how it impacts people's lives.
So not just numbers and graphs, but the real-world consequences.
Precisely. It delves into things like income inequality, poverty, the distribution of opportunities. It wants you to think about how those macroeconomic policies affect different groups within society. It's about making those connections between the economic indicators and the broader social and political landscape.
Right. Recognizing that economics isn't just some abstract concept. It has real-world implications for everyone.
Absolutely. Now, on to Chapter 7, the Keynesian model. This one's pretty central to understanding macroeconomics, wouldn't you say?
It does seem like a big one. If I remember correctly, this chapter introduces a whole framework for understanding those economic ups and downs and what role the government can play in smoothing things out.
You got it. The Keynesian model, named after that influential economist, John Maynard Keynes, it's had a huge impact on macroeconomic thinking and policy. And your study guide lays out those learning outcomes, emphasizing the need to grasp those basic assumptions of the model and its implications for policy.
Okay, so before we get into the model itself, can you remind me of the historical context? The textbook mentions something about the Great Depression and a clash of economic ideas.
Yes, the Great Depression, that was a major turning point. It really challenged those classical economic theories that dominated at the time, those theories that stressed how markets were self-regulating and that governments shouldn't really interfere.
It was like the invisible hand of the market.
Exactly. But then the Great Depression hit, and those classical theories just couldn't fully explain why it happened or how to fix it. That's where Keynes came in. He argued that markets could sometimes get stuck and that governments could actually play a role in stabilizing things, especially during those economic downturns.
So Keynes was basically saying that sometimes the market needs a little help.
Exactly. He argued that government intervention, particularly through what we call fiscal policy, could help get things back on track.
Okay, so let's unpack those basic assumptions of the Keynesian model. What are those key ideas that underpin this whole framework?
Well, one of the central ideas highlighted in the document is this concept of aggregate demand. Keynes argued that the total spending in the economy, what we call aggregate demand, is a key driver of economic activity.
So the more people and businesses and government spend, the more economic activity we see.
Exactly. And Keynes emphasized that this aggregate demand can fluctuate, it can go up or down, influenced by things like consumer confidence, what businesses are expecting, interest rates, and those government policies we talked about. He argued that during those recessions, aggregate demand can fall short of what the economy is actually capable of producing.
So you end up with unemployment and resources that aren't being used.
Precisely. Now, how does the Keynesian model propose to address that problem? Well, that's where fiscal policy comes in. Keynes argued that governments could use their spending and taxing powers to nudge that aggregate demand back in the right direction.
So like if the economy is slowing down, the government could step in and increase spending to stimulate demand.
Exactly. Think of it like this. During a recession, when businesses and consumers are pulling back, the government can step in and spend more on things like infrastructure projects or social programs. That puts money into people's pockets, encourages them to spend more, and helps to boost the economy. And your document emphasizes this concept called the multiplier effect.
Ah, yes, the multiplier effect. That's the idea that an initial injection of spending can have this ripple effect throughout the economy, creating even more activity, right?
You got it. Think about it like this. Let's say the government spends an extra $100 million on a road construction project. That money goes to the construction workers, right?
Right, and they'll spend some of that money on groceries, clothes, maybe a night out.
Exactly. And then those grocery stores, clothing shops, and restaurants, they see their revenues go up and they can hire more workers or buy more supplies. And then those workers and suppliers spend some of their income and so on. It's like that initial $100 million keeps circulating, multiplying its impact on the economy.
So it's this chain reaction of spending and income generation.
Precisely. And the multiplier effect, as your document explains, amplifies the impact of that initial spending injection.
Okay, so that's how fiscal policy can stimulate the economy during a downturn. But what about when the economy is overheating, when inflation is running too hot?
Well, in that case, the government can use what we call contractionary fiscal policy. They can reduce their spending or raise taxes to try to cool things down and bring that inflation under control. The document really stresses understanding both expansionary and contractionary fiscal policies and how they can impact aggregate demand.
Okay, so it's about using those fiscal tools to manage the economy, trying to smooth out those bumps in the business cycle.
Exactly, but your study guide also points out that there are limits to how effective these policies can be. It depends on a bunch of factors, like how big that multiplier effect is, the timing of those interventions, and the overall health of the economy.
Right, it's not a magic wand. And the document stresses the importance of looking at real-world examples.
Absolutely. It provides some case studies, including some from South Africa, to help you understand how fiscal policy has actually been used to address economic challenges.
Okay, so it's about connecting the theory with what's actually happening in the world.
Exactly. Now, on to Chapter 8, we delve into the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model.
Yes, the ADAS model.
Yeah.
This one feels like a visual powerhouse, doesn't it? It brings together those forces of demand and supply to explain how prices and output are determined in the economy.
You got it. The ADS model is a great tool for analyzing those economic fluctuations and seeing how different policies can impact things. Your study guide outlines the key components, emphasizing how shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply can influence both the price level and the level of output.
Okay, can you walk me through how this model actually works? What are the key elements?
Sure. So you have the AD curve, which represents aggregate demand. It slopes downward, showing that as prices go down, people tend to buy more.
Right, that makes sense. Lower prices, more demand.
Exactly. And then you have the AS curve for aggregate supply, which slopes upward, at least in the short run. It shows that as prices go up, firms are willing to produce and sell more.
Okay, so higher prices, more supply. Makes sense.
It's all about finding that balance, that point where buyers and sellers agree on a price and quantity. And the document wants to make sure you can explain why those curves have those specific shapes.
Okay, so that's where the two curves intersect.
Yeah.
That's the equilibrium point where supply and demand meet. But these curves aren't static, right? They can shift around.
That's right. The document emphasizes that you need to understand what can cause both the AD and the AS curves to shift. So, for instance, changes in things like consumer confidence, government spending, or interest rates can all shift that AD curve.
Okay, those are like demand-side factors. What about supply-side factors that can shift the AS curve?
Things like changes in input prices, wages or oil prices or technological advancements or even changes in the availability of resources. All of those can shift the AS curve.
So it's a dynamic system constantly adjusting to those changing conditions.
Exactly. And the ADAS model helps us visualize those shifts and analyze what they mean for the economy. Your document even highlights the concept of stagflation. Have you ever heard of that?
Vaguely. I think it's like when you have high inflation, 80 unemployment at the same time, right? The study guide mentions that we should be able to explain this phenomenon, how it's caused by those shifts in aggregate supply.
You got it. Stagflation is this nasty combination of high inflation and high unemployment. And it's often caused by what we call a negative supply shock, like a sudden spike in oil prices or a disruption to global supply chains, something that makes it more expensive for businesses to produce and sell things.
Okay, so those higher costs get passed on to consumers as higher prices. BUT businesses might also cut back on production and lay off workers because it's more expensive to produce.
Exactly. So you get hit with both higher prices and lower output, which can lead to that stagflation scenario. And what makes stagflation really tricky is that those traditional policy responses might not work very well. If you try to stimulate demand to fight the unemployment, you might just make the inflation even worse.
Right, it's like a catch-22 situation. And the study guide mentions that we should be able to explain how changes in AD and AS can affect that equilibrium, both national income and the price level.
It does. It wants you to be able to analyze how different shocks to the economy, whether they hit the demand side or the supply side, can impact both the price level and the amount of stuff being produced, the output.
Right, and those changes can ripple through and affect things like GDP, inflation, and unemployment.
Exactly. The ADAS model is a great tool for understanding those ripple effects.
Okay, it's definitely a powerful framework. Now, the document points out this interesting detail about stagflation, saying that an increase in the price of imported oil can often be a trigger.
That makes sense, doesn't it? Oil is such a crucial input for so many industries. If its price goes up, well, those costs get passed along and can affect everything.
Right, it can make it more expensive for businesses to produce A&D for consumers to buy things.
Exactly. It's a reminder of just how interconnected the global economy is, how events in one part of the world can ripple out and affect everyone.
I'm definitely getting a sense of the complexity here.
It is complex, but also fascinating, wouldn't you say? Now, are you ready to tackle the often feared topic of inflation? Chapter 10 awaits.
Let's do it. I'm ready to face this economic bogeyman head on. The study guide says we need to be able to define inflation and explain those different types.
All right, well, your document starts by clarifying what inflation actually is. It's a sustained increase in the general price level, not just a one-time jump in the price of, your favorite coffee or something.
Right, it's like a broader upward trend in prices across the economy.
Exactly. And your document emphasizes the importance of understanding those different measures of inflation, like the CPI, the Consumer Price Index.
Okay, so the CPI, that's the one that tracks the prices of a basket of goods and services that consumers typically buy.
Exactly. It's like a gauge of how much more expensive it's getting to buy those everyday things.
How?
And the textbook also mentions the PPI, the Producer Price Index, which tracks prices at the wholesale level.
Okay, so that's like a measure of inflation for businesses.
Exactly. And your document goes on to discuss the various ways inflation can affect different players in the economy. What stands out to you?
Well, it's pretty clear that inflation can eat away at our purchasing power. If prices are rising faster than our wages, we can buy less with the same amount of money.
Precisely. That's one of the most direct impacts of inflation. It reduces the real value of our earnings and savings. And your document points out this interesting phenomenon called bracket creep. Have you ever heard of that?
I don't think so.
So bracket creep happens when inflation pushes people into higher income tax brackets, even though their real income hasn't actually increased.
So even though I'm not really earning more, I might end up paying a higher percentage of my income in taxes just because of rising prices.
Exactly. It's one of those sneaky ways inflation can impact us, even if our wages are keeping up with those rising prices.
Let's definitely keep an eye out for that.
Yep.
Now, what about those different types of inflation?
Your document outlines two main types: demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Demand pull inflation, that happens when aggregate demand outpaces aggregate supply. Too much money chasing too few goods, you could say.
So it's like a bidding war for those scarce goods and services driving up prices.
Exactly. Now, cost push inflation, that happens when the costs of production increase, like wages or raw materials, and businesses have to raise prices to keep up.
So it's like they're passing those higher costs on to consumers.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the document stresses that it's really important to understand what's driving inflation, whether it's demand pull or cost push, because that helps you figure out the right policy response.
Right, like you need to diagnose the problem before you can prescribe the cure.
Exactly. Now, moving on to Chapter 11, we confront the challenging issue of unemployment.
This one always feels a bit heavy, but it's clearly a crucial issue that impacts so many people's lives. And the document mentions we need to understand the different types of unemployment.
It does. And your study guide breaks down those different types: frictional, structural, cyclical, and seasonal.
Okay, let's see if I can remember those from my reading. Frictional unemployment, that's the temporary kind that happens when people are between jobs. Yeah.
You got it. It's a natural part of any dynamic labor market, as people move, change careers, or acquire new skills.
Right. And then there's structural unemployment, which happens when the skills workers have don't match the skills that employers are looking for.
Exactly. That can happen because of technological changes, globalization, shifts in what consumers want, all sorts of reasons.
Okay, so frictional and structural unemployment are kind of like the background noise of the labor market. But then there's cyclical unemployment, which is driven by those economic downturns, right?
Exactly. When the economy weakens, businesses lay off workers because there's less demand for their products or services.
And then there's seasonal unemployment, which is tied to those, well, seasonal fluctuations in demand for certain types of work.
Exactly, like agricultural workers or people in the tourism industry. Their jobs often depend on the time of year.
Okay, so those are the main types of unemployment. And the document emphasizes that we need to understand the costs of unemployment, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
It does. For individuals, unemployment can mean lost income, financial struggles, a lower quality of life, and even health problems. It can also be really tough on mental health, leading to stress, anxiety, and depression.
Right, it's like a domino effect of negative consequences.
Exactly. And for society, unemployment means lost output. Those unemployed workers aren't contributing to the economy's productive capacity. It can lead to increased crime, social unrest, and put a strain on those safety net programs.
So it's a lose-lose situation, both for individuals and for society.
Absolutely. Now, your study guide also dives into those policies to reduce unemployment. What stands out to you?
Well, it seems like there are two main approaches, right? Supply-side policies and demand-side policies. The supply-side ones focus on improving the skills and quality of the workforce through things like education and training programs.
Exactly. It's about giving workers those tools they need to compete in the job market.
And then demand-side policies are aimed at boosting the overall economy, which should create more jobs in the process. So things like government spending on infrastructure projects or tax cuts to encourage people to spend more would fall into that category.
That's a great overview, and the document emphasizes that the right policy approach often depends on what types of unemployment are most prevalent.
So it's about figuring out what's causing the unemployment and then choosing the right tools to address it.
Exactly. Now, what about the Phillips curve? Your document highlights this concept that suggests there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
Okay, remind me how that works.
Basically, it suggests that policymakers often face this dilemma. If they try to stimulate the economy to lower unemployment, they might end up with higher inflation. But if they try to control inflation by slowing things down, they might see unemployment rise.
So it's like they're trying to walk this tightrope, balancing those two goals.
Precisely. And your document stresses the importance of understanding this trade-off and how it can inform those policy decisions.
Okay, so it's not as simple as just saying we want low inflation, A&D, low unemployment. There are real trade-offs to consider.
Absolutely. Now, moving on to Chapter 12, we explore the exciting realm of economic growth. And the study guide really stresses that you should be able to define and explain those factors that contribute to economic growth.
Excellent. This chapter gets into what drives those long-term improvements in living standards. And your document starts by defining economic growth as a sustained increase in real GDP per capita.
So it's not just about the economy getting bigger, it's about each person having more. Exactly. It's about expanding the economy's capacity to produce, not just experiencing those temporary upswings.
Okay, so it's like growing the economic pie itself, not just dividing it up differently.
A perfect analogy. And your document breaks down those various supply and demand factors that drive this growth. What stands out to you on the supply side?
Well, it seems like having a lot of those factors of production is key. Things like natural resources, a skilled workforce, efficient infrastructure, and technological innovation. The document emphasizes understanding the role of technology in driving economic growth.
Exactly. Those are the ingredients for a productive economy. And on the demand side, it's about having strong demand for those goods and services, both from within the country and from other countries.
Right, because if nobody wants to buy what you're producing, there's no incentive to grow.
Precisely. And your document highlights the importance of entrepreneurship. Those are the folks who take risks, innovate, bring those factors of production together in new ways to meet those evolving needs.
They're like the engine of innovation and growth.
Exactly. Now, your document also brings up this concept called capital deepening. Have you heard of that?
I don't think so.
Capital deepening happens when you increase the amount of capital per worker, making those workers more productive. It's like giving each worker a better tool or machine so they can produce more. And your study guide wants you to understand the difference between capital deepening and what's called capital widening.
Okay, so it's not just about having more capital overall.
So it's not just about having more capital overall. It's about making sure that capital is being used effectively to boost productivity.
Right, like the difference between just buying more shovels for a group of diggers versus, giving each digger a more efficient excavator.
A perfect analogy. And your document points out that capital deepening is often seen as a key driver of those long-term improvements in living standards. It also mentions the importance of understanding the role of savings and investment in promoting economic growth.
Okay, so investing in things that make workers more productive, things like education, technology, infrastructure, that seems crucial for sustained growth.
It is, and your document also talks about the need to create a good environment for investment, both from within the country and from outside. Things like stable economic policies, protecting property rights, having a legal system that works well, those all matter.
Right, it's about making it attractive for people to invest and for businesses to thrive.
Exactly. And your document also touches on the challenges of making sure that growth is sustainable and inclusive. Making sure that everyone benefits and that it doesn't come at the expense of the environment.
That's an important point. It's not just about growing the economy for the sake of growing it. It's about making sure that growth is good for everyone and for the planet.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone through those key concepts from each chapter, highlighted those learning outcomes your document emphasizes, and connected those ideas to real-world examples.
We have. It's been quite a journey through the world of economics. From those basic building blocks to the complexities of policies and global trends. We even tackled that mystery chapter with the missing title.
We did. It's a good reminder that there's always more to learn, and economics is always evolving.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for being such a fantastic guide through this economic landscape.
It's been my pleasure. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a good grasp of those key principles and concepts you'll need for your course.
I think it has. And to our listener, we hope you've enjoyed this exploration and feel a bit more comfortable navigating the fascinating world of economics.
Remember, economics is all around us. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and try to connect those dots between the theory and what you see happening in the world.
And most importantly, use this knowledge to make informed decisions, both in your own life and as an engaged citizen.
Well said.
Until next time, keep on learning and keep diving deep.